It is 4 o'clock, so we're gonna go ahead and get the event started. I think people will still be coming in, but we'll just go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to this event, Bring Back the Pollinators, presented by Dave Kollen of the Xerces Society. My name is Elliot Stapleton. I'm from the Camas Public Library. I'm just going to give a couple housekeeping items, and then I'm going to turn things over to Marlene from NatureScaping of Southwest Washington. This event is a co-production of the Camas Public Library and NatureScaping of Southwest Washington. The event will be recorded, so everyone who registered for this webinar, you will receive a follow-up email next week with a link to the recording. So if you wanted to watch it again or share it, you can use that link. So there will be a section at the end of Dave's presentation for questions. And if you would like to ask a question, you can do that with the chat. At the bottom of your Zoom window, you should see an icon that says chat. So if you click on that, you can type in your questions. We'll get to the questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to go ahead and submit your question during the presentation, and then we'll wait to the end for Dave to respond to them. And let's see, I think that's it for me. So I'm gonna turn things over to Marlene from NatureScaping of Southwest Washington.
Hi, everybody. For those members of NatureScaping, welcome. For non-members, welcome too. Maybe you'll consider becoming a member at some point. Just a little bit of history. So before COVID, we used to have monthly classes in person at the Casey Center, which is adjacent to the Wildlife Botanical Gardens in Brush Prairie. And that's what actually NatureScaping does, is we maintain, among other things, those gardens at the Wildlife Botanical Gardens in Brush Prairie. If you've never been, you might want to consider visiting us. It's a 3-acre with 10 distinct garden areas. And people use it for all different purposes. So come and check it out if you haven't already. But our classes used to meet monthly at the Casey Center in person. But since COVID, we pretty much are resigned to Zoom. And in order to come to our classes, this was a member benefit. And so because of the Zoom, everyone is welcome to come. However, if you are not a member and you care to make a donation, we would definitely appreciate it. You can go on our website, naturescaping.org, and do that there. Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dave Kollen from the Xerces Society. He will tell you all about himself and enjoy this very important topic. I know you've heard about the pollinators before if you've been anywhere in this world, but it's quite important, and they're in dire straits right now, which I'm sure Dave will mention. So please enjoy, and as Elliot said, you can redo this webinar by checking out the link and watching it again and again. So thank you all very much for attending. Dave, take it away.
Okay, hello everyone. I want to thank you for coming to listen to this. I'm a Xerces Society ambassador. What that means is I'm a volunteer that is involved in outreach activities for the Xerces Society. I'm also a master naturalist in the state of Oregon and a master melitologist. That's a person that studies bees, apprentice level. So I just started that program this year. So the Xerces Society, I want to talk a little bit about that. We are active in invertebrate conservation. This year is our 50th anniversary, and we're protecting wildlife by focusing on conservation. Sorry, bear with me here. I tried to use my mouse scroll and it goes way too fast. So we do our work through conservation, advocacy, research, and education. So the latter is what I'm here doing right now. We work with many partners. There are roughly 12,000 Xerces Society members. We're a worldwide organization. There are a lot of private foundations that provide funding for us. We work with scientists from around the world and state aid, federal agencies. Certain groups in Xerces work very closely with farmers, land managers, and we've got a lot of people that are, working in their homes, in their yards to help put a conservation plan in place. Before we talk about pollinators, I want to just mention a little bit about pollination. I'm sure most of you, everyone I'm sure has heard the term and knows what it is. But just to set it straight, pollination is the act of transferring pollen from the male stamen, actually the anther, over to the female pistil of the plant. Pollination occurs, through a variety of mechanisms, what we call vectors: wind, water, bats, birds, and of course, what we think of more often being bees, butterflies, things like that. So why do we care about pollinators? Well, the main reason is that 85% of flowering plants require a pollinator of some kind in order to reproduce. And other than the fact that it's lovely to have plants around, why do we care about that? Well, food, of course. It's estimated that 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food that we consume relies upon pollination services of some kind. Globally, we're talking about 1,200 crops. And in the US alone, these pollination services are on the order of tens of billions of dollars, depending on how you calculate it. Some years back, Whole Foods went through the trouble to demonstrate to their customers what would happen if we lost our pollinators. And so on the left-hand side, you see a produce department. And on the right-hand side, you see the same produce department after they removed items that rely on pollinators. And things that were removed, include apples and avocados and, cranberries and things like that, a whole lot more. And, this just kind of shows you that our shelves would be quite a bit more empty in certain areas. They did the same thing in the dairy department. And you can see again on the left, the before, and on the right, the after photo. And it may not be obvious why dairy would be impacted because, generally you wouldn't think that we rely on pollinators for that. But we have to remember that one of the main feeds used in the dairy industry is alfalfa. And alfalfa is sown from seed, and pollinators are required to produce that alfalfa seed crop. So they actually are very important for us in that respect also. But, pollinators, it's not just about humans and our food needs, right? They're at the center of very complex food webs. Most birds, I forget the percentage, it's very high, rely on seeds and nuts as a significant part of their diet. Many species of fish rely on invertebrates. In Yellowstone National Park, grizzly bears, when they're fattening up for the fall, or for the winter, I should say, during the summer and fall, one of their favorite targets is something called a miller moth. And during the daytime, they hide under rocks. And each miller moth has got about a half of a calorie of energy in it. And a grizzly bear, a busy one, can eat up to 40,000 of these moths in one day. So that's 20,000 calories of energy that will go onto their fat stores just from these moths. And roughly 95% of terrestrial birds use insects or some other arthropod during nest raising, when they're raising their young birds. So they did a study on Carolina chickadees, and over slightly more than 2 weeks, a pair of chickadees brought 10,000 different insects into the nest. So scientists were watching these over that whole period. 10,000 caterpillars and things like that taken. So, invertebrates are extremely important, and pollinators are part of that invertebrate guild. In addition to what I've talked about, the necessities, there are other things that we get and that help us have enrichment in our lives. And pollinators are responsible for these too. Now, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about pollinator diversity. On the screen here, you see the 6 main groups of invertebrate pollinators. Starting at the top, we've got butterflies, moths, flies, beetles, wasps, and bees. Now, bees are by far the most important pollinators in the group that I just showed you. And today we're going to focus on that. Now, bees have got 3 distinct behaviors that these other pollinators don't have. Number one, they collect and transport pollen. So they're not there just for the nectar. They forage in the area around their nests. There's something that we call a central area forager. And they have a property called flower constancy. And if you watch a bee on a foraging bout, you'll see that they will tend to go to the same species of flower during that whole bout. Now, this isn't absolute, and they're known for testing other flowers, but on any given bout, they're really focusing on one species. This helps them become more efficient at handling the flower, and it also ensures that pollen is going to the right species of plant. As you can imagine, if you were just like a butterfly, visiting one plant and going to another one and then a third one, well, that's not doing a whole lot to take pollen where it needs to go. You can't take pollen from a tomato plant and transfer it to a blueberry and expect something good to happen. Now, honeybees are undoubtedly one of the most recognizable bees, if not the most recognizable bee. It's what many of us think of if we say bee, either that or say a bumblebee. But they're not typical. Honeybees are social, and they live in huge colonies, and they're the only ones in North America that produce honey. And these honey stores allow them to last and overwinter as a group. None of our natives have that capability. So, bumblebees are a social bee native, but they cannot last through a winter because they don't have honey stores. Honeybees are, an extremely important agricultural commodity, well, not a commodity, but help out in the agricultural arena, because pollination services provided by them help everything. I mean, they're brought in for alfalfa, they bring them for apple orchards, etc., and they truck them around. I'm sure you've probably seen stacks of honeybee hives out in agricultural areas. You probably have all heard of something called colony collapse disorder. They've had a lot of trouble, and that's unfortunate. But today we're going to talk about natives. We're not going to focus on honeybees. They are invasive. They're European. They were introduced by the early folks that came over. I think in 1620 was when the original honeybees arrived here. And they were brought over for wax primarily, not the honey. Wax was a very important commodity at that time. So our native bees, most of them are solitary. 90% of our native bees are solitary bees. In general, they're very gentle. They're very unlikely to sting. Being solitary bees, they don't have a honey store or a nest that they need to worry about protecting, a colony, when I say nest this time. The only way you can really get them to sting you is you've really got to provoke them. Squeeze them between your fingers, and then maybe you're going to get them to sting you. In North America, well, first let me say, worldwide, it's estimated that there are 20 to 25,000 species of bees. In North America, north of Mexico, the estimate is somewhere between 3,600 and 4,000 species. Oregon has got, again, an estimated 600 to 800 species. Washington, the estimate's about 600. Washington's a little bit further north, as you know, and a lot of solitary bee diversity is in more desert areas, drier areas. And that's one reason it's probably a little bit lower in Washington. If you look at a city the size of Portland, you have maybe 80 to 100 different species of bees. And then in a single garden, you may have 20 to 30, depending on, how good a pollinator habitat you have. On the left-hand side here, you'll see an example of just some of the more common bees that are found in Oregon. And due to our proximity, the same thing is pretty much going to be true for your part of Washington. Surprisingly, there's very little data that we have on the distribution of these solitary native bees. Bumblebees, they're easy to identify. Well, I shouldn't say easy, but with a little training, you can identify these to species level on the wing most of the time in your region. But the same is not true for these solitary bees. A lot of them look very similar, and you really have to get them under a microscope sometimes to tell what they really are. So there are projects underway that are working to establish, where and what we have in various parts of the world, really, it's going on. I'm part of a project in Oregon that does work on that. Here is a perfect example of bee diversity. On the left, you have something that's called a valley carpenter bee. It's a Xylocopa species. The inset picture is something called a Perdita minima. It doesn't really have a common name, so you can just call it the world's smallest bee. And if you look at this bee on the left, the carpenter bee, is maybe up to 1.25 inches in length. You could probably fit 4 of the little Perdita into just that one compound eye on the right side of that image. You know, just amazing the difference in scale there on those animals. There are just a vast number of colors and patterns on bees. They can go from, you know, really dull black to these very shiny, almost iridescent metallic blues and greens. You see the sweat bee at the top, very, you know, beautiful bee up close. On the lower left, we have a nocturnal bee. And although this bee is not native to North America, it's found in Central America. The pictures here just to show some diversity. I'm gonna, hopefully you can see my cursor here. There's 3 little bumps basically between the eyes. And what these are, they're actually simple eyes. So this bee, all bees actually have got 5 eyes, 3 simple eyes and 2 compound eyes. If you look at these 3, and then you look, you can only see 1 up here on the sweat bee on the top. But you see it's much smaller than these are. And even the eyes, the proportion of eye to head on this sweat bee is much smaller than the head of this nocturnal bee. So this nocturnal bee is all about being able to see in low levels of light. And these anatomical differences actually allow this bee to have a sensitivity to light that's roughly 27 times greater than a normal daylight operating bee. And then finally on the right-hand side, we have a fuzzy-legged leafcutter bee. This is a male, and you see pollen on it. The hairs on the front legs are not to collect pollen. The pollen is really accidental because males don't bring pollen. They don't carry pollen intentionally. But it's thought that for this bee, the hairs are used to get floral scents off of the flowers and carry it on their on the hair on the legs. And the thing is that maybe this attracts females when they're looking to find a mate. So you can think of that as kind of a bee cologne. Now, all bees have got, or let me just backtrack, most bees, but nearly all bees have got a pollen carrying structure. If you look on the left here, you see a bumblebee, and on the right, there's an abdominal yellow stripe. And just to the left of that, on this hind leg, is a clump of pollen and nectar. And that is in an area that's called a corbicula. It's a little depression on the leg or a flat spot surrounded by long hairs. And the bumblebee goes and packs the pollen and nectar into that and carries it back to the nest like that. The bee in the center, if you look at the hind leg on that, it looks like a bottle brush almost, and that's called a scopa. And the scopa is used to pack pollen grains into. It's very dense with hair. There are some other structures sometimes that can be found on a bee like this, but typically that scopa will be the main way of carrying pollen. And then finally, if you look on the right, that is a leafcutter bee, Megachilidae family. And the scopal hairs on a leafcutter are under the abdomen. And you can see how much pollen that this leafcutter bee has packed in to the hairs under the abdomen. So these are all mechanisms that bees of various species use to move pollen from the flowers back to their nest. This bee maybe doesn't look like a bee to most people. It's very tiny, as you can tell from the dime that's up there, and it's actually a cuckoo bee. Cuckoo bees get their name from cuckoo birds. And for those of you that don't know about cuckoo birds have got a nasty little habit of going and finding a nest of a bird from a different species that's, say, similar in size to themselves and their eggs. And they will go to that nest, and when the parents are not around, they'll knock the eggs out, they'll lay their own eggs, and then let the parents take care of them and raise the young. And most of the time, the birds that this happens to, they don't even realize what they're doing. So cuckoo bees are kind of the same, only they do that to other bees. So they'll sneak down into a nest and find an egg, a cell where there's an egg, and they'll go and deposit their own egg in there and kill the other egg that they find. And then, they're basically stealing the provisions that way. Another area of diversity in bees is the length of the tongue. If you look here, this is a fairly long-tongued bumblebee, and the length of that tongue allows them to go deeply into the corolla of a flower to get to the nectaries in the back. Other bees, will have short tongues, and they may only be able to forage on something with a very shallow flower, like, say, a dandelion, sunflowers, things in the, aster family. And there's, bees in between. This is an example of coevolution that has happened between some species of bees and some species of plants. And, taken to an extreme, you can get situations where there are cases where one species of plant is entirely dependent on one species of bee and vice versa. So it's really interesting the way, evolution occurs. So a lot of bees are generalists, but there's a few of them that are really, really specialist. And before going on, if you see one of these at your picnic, remember, this is a wasp. Wasps are not bees. If you look closely, you'll see there's no hair evident on this wasp at all. In fact, they'll have a few, but you really need a microscope to see it. They're very spiny, and this is, we've all seen these. It's a German yellow jacket, a vespid wasp, and it was, it's an invasive. They're aggressive. Most native wasps are not so aggressive, although there are those that are, the hornets and things like that. There's a lot of solitary wasps, and they're not unlike solitary bees in that they tend to be pretty docile, and you've got to really provoke them in order to get stung. But if you see one of these, don't immediately go grab a can of Raid. Well, you don't want to spray your ham, but also in your yard, because these guys are carnivores, I mean, and they are going to take care of pests in your yard. They're perfect for doing that. So you really want to keep them around if you can. Bear in mind that they are beneficial in that respect. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the natural history of bees. And what natural history means is, what do they do for a living? How do they get by? How do they get along? As I mentioned earlier, 90% of our bees are solitary bees. And what is presented here is an example of a solitary bee life cycle. In the center at the top, we have a mining bee. It's an andrenid bee. And most adult bees, including mining bees, at the most will live for maybe a month. A lot of times it's only 2 weeks or something like that. So during that time, that they're out, they mate typically only one time, and then they get busy with creating nest sites and provisioning the nest and laying eggs. So on the right-hand side, you'll see an example of a nest. This is obviously a ground nester. And if you look, you'll see kind of a shiny substance on the cutaway wall, on that back wall. And this would be maybe a resin or waxes sometimes that they put on there. They're thought to have antimicrobial properties and anti-fungicide properties. And at the bottom of this nest, you'll see what's called bee bread. And bee bread is basically a mixture of pollen and nectar. And that's the provision for the egg that this adult is going to lay. It's going to lay one egg on the bee bread. And over a period of 1 to 3 weeks, that egg is going to turn into a larva. And the reason I'm saying 1 to 3 weeks is that it varies by species. So after that, the larva goes through 5, what they call instars, 5 stages. And again, that'll be 6 to 8 weeks of time, depending on the species of bee. And then finally, there's going to be a pupal stage. And that is the longest lasting stage. And that pupa is going to create a cocoon. It's going to stay in there. It's going to develop into an adult over a period of 8 to 9 months. And then finally, at the appropriate time of year, it's going to emerge and the cycle is going to start all over again. And I say appropriate time of year because some bees emerge in the spring, some late in the summer. It depends on the species and some of the environmental conditions that are going on. And in fact, interestingly enough, there are some species of bees that can remain underground for multiple months, multiple years, and emerge after years of being underground. And, there they are. So this is typically in a desert type region where rains are, you never know when you're going to get them, sporadic. And so they've evolved to be able to handle that kind of situation. Now, roughly 70% of our native species are ground nesting bees. So the majority of them are ground nesters. And you saw that simple little nest cell on the previous slide. Here are a couple of other examples on the right-hand side that show some of the underground architectures. And, this is a really interesting area. There are many, many different architectures that are employed. Sometimes multiple females of some species will share a nest entrance. They're called semi-social. They take care of their own egg cells. So they're not really helping each other, but they're sharing an entrance. There are some that actually help each other. Just about every variation you can think of, it's there. Some of these will nest in large aggregations. So in the center there, we see a lawn that's got what looks to be ant nests, but these are in fact an aggregation of ground nesting bees. And you're going to typically find something like this on southwest exposed slopes. That's what they prefer to do. And they like to have a kind of a sandy soil It's helpful to have, bare ground for them. Makes it a little bit easier for them. And we'll talk more about conservation later on. Oops, sorry, I just went the wrong way. Now I'd like to talk about the bumblebee life cycle. So they are our only real, what they call a eusocial, that's EU social bee. And what that means is true social. We're going to start here with a hibernating queen at the top. Sometime in late winter or early spring, when the conditions are right outside, this hibernating queen is going to emerge, and she's going to start looking for a nest site. That's something that we call questing. And when she finds a good nest site, she's going to go and start provisioning. She's going to go and build a wax cell to hold nectar, and she's going to fill that up. You see that on the left, that's called a honey pot. And then she's going to create a brood clump out of wax and lay eggs and provision that with nectar and pollen. And then she's going to sit on that clump, much like a bird sits on eggs. In fact, bumblebees have got a spot on their abdomen that has got a crease in it, and they will actually, or not abdomen, sorry, on the thorax, they're in the center, and they'll actually press down pretty tight on that clump. And since they've got a honey pot there, they're able to sustain their energy needs over a fairly long period of time, multiple days, without having to go out and forage. And this way they can keep the larvae warm and they'll develop faster. Now that first group of larvae, it's typically 8 to 16, will become workers. They'll take over the foraging duties, and the queen after that is going to remain in the nest, because going outside is always dangerous. So there's always chance of a predator, and you want your queen to not expose herself that way. So as we go from spring, early summer over to summer, we're going to eventually hit a colony peak sometime in the summer or late summer. And at colony peak, we've got a maximum number of individuals, and then something called colony changeover occurs. And at that time, when the queen lays eggs, she no longer lays eggs of workers, but she starts laying eggs that are going to be either drones, that is males, or future queens. Those eggs will hatch. The males leave the nest after a few days, and they never come back to the nest. The queens will go in and out of the nest, but they go out, they try to find a mate. And then by this time, workers last maybe 2 to 3 weeks in a nest. So since the queen has stopped producing workers, the workforce after 3 weeks has gone down to essentially nothing. And what happens then is it's called colony decline. The old founding queen dies, and the mated queens start the process, or they end the process by finding what's called a hibernaculum. So they go into hibernation, and now the process starts all over again. Bumblebees are cavity nesters. And so they like to find places that have a large enough cavity for them to create their nests. Typically, they don't go more than 100, 200 individuals, even at maximum colony size. Some of them much less than that. Some species will only be 50 bees. They like rodent nests, especially because old rodent nest will have insulation already there for them, so it makes it really nice. And to encourage this kind of thing, you like to have some areas that are not real tidy. And these are also really good places for butterflies to overwinter, those that do. So I said 70% ground nesters, that leaves another 30%. And that 30% are tunnel nesters. They will use old beetle borer holes in trees or stumps. Also pithy stems, you know, so like a evergreen at the end of the season, if you break off or cut off a branch, the center of that is something that can be dug into pretty easily, and some bees will do that. Others want a cavity that's already clear. But what they'll do then is create a series of egg cells, brood cells. And on the right-hand side are examples of two of these. Now, the one at the top is from a leafcutter bee. And what you see here are 4 completed cells, and they are lined with cut out sections of leaves or flower petals. And that lining is around the outside of the cell, and it also creates barriers between the cells. So on the left-hand side, that would be the first cell that was done. So she would have created that cell, left it open, created the bee bread, laid an egg, closed it off, started working on the next one, and then all the way out. When she gets to the end of the stem, she's going to plug that, in this case, with a wad of leaf cuttings or, you know, flower petal cuttings. Down below that, you see some kind of a mason bee nest. Now, what they're going to use is, you know, sand or chewed up wood or things like that. They're going to do the same thing, though. They're going to create cells. And here you see 2 cells that have got the bee bread with an egg laid on it. And on the right-hand side, it's open, and she's continuing to build there. As far as nest materials go, bees use a number of different things. I mentioned leaf pieces already, or pieces of flower. This is a Megachilidae leafcutter bee carrying a chunk of flower petal down into the nest. So it's going to be doing that lining that we just talked about. They'll also use little pebbles and soil and resin when they're constructing their cells. When it comes to foraging, by that I mean when it comes to finding nectar, bees will generally drink nectar from just about any accessible flower. So accessible, by that I mean we're going back to that tongue length again. So, you know, a short tongued bee cannot use every flower, but if it's accessible, they'll drink from just about anything. When it comes to pollen, though, they're much more choosy about what they will take. There's evidence that bees actually have the ability to determine the quality of the pollen that's being presented by the plant. If you go and look at pollen from various species of plants, the amount of amino acids in that and other nutrients in that pollen varies quite a bit. So for plants in the bean family, the Fabaceae is what it is, they're known to be pretty high, pretty good quality plants. And if you start to become aware of good pollinator plants and plants that are favored by things like bumblebees, you'll find that, oh, wow, there's that family. It keeps showing up and showing up. And the reason is they've got really good pollen. So now that we've learned a bit about bees, I'd like to talk about the threats that they face. So there are four major threats. There's, minor ones, but these four are habitat loss, pesticides, pathogens and introduced species, and climate change. So habitat loss is probably the biggest factor right now in terms of threats to our pollinators. This is an example of habitat conversion in an urban or suburban area. We all are, painfully aware of what this means. And there's basically nothing there for a pollinator. This habitat loss is associated with farming. Intensive row agriculture, like we see on the left, leaves absolutely nothing for our pollinators. There are systems of agriculture, though, where you have less intensity and you build in things like hedgerows and rotation with certain pollinator-friendly cover crops and things on the edges of the land that can make agriculture work fairly well with pollinators. And in fact, there's a lot of work being done to show that done in the right way, the pollinators will actually benefit the farmers if they're willing to put a little bit more work into it, not go into these giant fields. On the right-hand side picture, what we have here is a habitat loss that's due to pesticide drift. Now, the crop on the right, believe it or not, is being organically grown. And that cloud that you see is pesticide. And that's not a good thing, obviously. There's a road to the left that's out of the picture, and the pesticide drift is coming from the left-hand side. Well, this pesticide drift is basically removing this habitat from availability of pollinators because it's poisoning it. So just another form of habitat loss. So these pesticides, they're, obviously the number 2 threat to bees. Back in 2013, you're close enough to Portland, you probably remember during Pollinator Week, there was a big bumblebee die-off. Over 2 weeks' time, 50,000 bumblebees died in a parking lot because they were foraging on the flowers of linden trees. And these linden trees had been treated with a systemic pesticide about 2 weeks prior to that. And that systemic pesticide worked its way up through the sap, into the flowers, into the nectar, and killed, this giant die-off. No one did anything wrong. The pesticide was applied per all regulations. And it just goes to show that, the best thing to do is not to use them if you can help it. The silver lining in this story is that in this particular municipality, they did create some regulations disallowing the use of these systemic pesticides on linden trees that were getting close to the blooming period. In the United States, annually, we apply 1 billion pounds of pesticides. And just try to wrap your head around what that number is. 1 billion pounds of poison is what we put out. Most of us think that, well, those darn farmers, they're the ones that are responsible for all that. And that's not necessarily true. There's been some studies done, in fact, one up in Washington, close to Puget Sound, that showed that pesticide use per acre was actually higher in urban and suburban areas than it was on adjacent farmland. And a lot of this is done for cosmetic reasons. And here we see this, manicured, beautiful landscape. It's not my cup of tea exactly, but a lot of people like this. And there's a lot of pesticides that are, applied purely because we don't want to have, any bug holes in our leaves. So what we end up with is poisoning our kids instead, and the stuff runs off into our water. So, try to eliminate pesticide use if you can do that, especially if there's not a really good reason. I guess it's a fourth threat here is pathogens third one, pathogens and introduced species. So here, the problem is introduced species can bring what we call novel diseases into our ecosystem. Novel meaning the stuff that we have living here has never seen it before and doesn't know how to deal with it. So if you look at the honeybee on the left, you'll see, if you look carefully, right at the front of the abdomen, there's something called a Varroa destructor mite. You've probably heard of Varroa mites. To date, I've not seen anything that shows that Varroa mites actually affect native bees. But there are viruses that are associated with Varroa mites that have been shown to affect native bees. So this is an example of, an imported bee. It continues to be imported. I mean, I said they will go back to 1620, but that importation continues to occur. And just an example of how they can affect our natives. The next picture over shows something called garlic mustard. It is an invasive plant. It easily outcompetes some of our native forage plants, and native plants are better for native species. And I'll talk more about that later. So you don't want to lose those because of an invasive. Third picture, everybody knows murder hornets, they call them. It's actually, Asian giant hornet is the common name, or it's another one of these vespid wasps like the yellow jacket is. And, they're starting to, they're established somewhat in BC. And as you all know, there's been several sightings in Washington state. And they are a danger to honeybees, but as far as I know, none of our natives. And then finally, introduced species can just create a problem because of resource competition. Sometimes there aren't enough flowers to go around. The last thing I want to talk about is climate change. And, we all know this, climate change plays out over decades. And it's not this immediate thing that we see. And so I'm going to talk about potential effects, some of which we're seeing. So potential impacts. One of them is changes in the geographic distributions of bee species. These species, they may move latitudinally, which means north or south, or maybe altitudinally, up or down. You might say, who cares? I mean, so they move a little bit, as long as they survive, it's not a problem. Well, what if they're boxed in? What if you've got a species of pollinator that lives, at 8,000 feet around Mount Hood, and it's getting warmer and it needs to go up or die. So how much more can it go? Well, if I remember correctly, something like 3,000 feet, but the top 1,000 feet is probably all rock. So that's not going to work. But the idea is they can't always move in order to acclimate, to be able to exist in a changing environment or changing climate. So species that are boxed in, they're going to go away. Another problem that's possible is the synchrony between bees and plants. We've already seen that bees require forage material. They require nectar, they require pollen. When they come out of that nest, you remember the hibernating bumblebee queen, when she comes out, there's got to be flowers there or she can't go and start working on a nest. So we have to have this overlap between emergence and rearing. To date, all the studies that I'm aware of, I've read about, are showing that the overlap is holding. In other words, these species seem to be somehow synchronized well enough that both the emergence of bees and flowering are occurring earlier, pretty much the same amount earlier, so that we're continuing to see an overlap. That's not a guarantee that that's going to continue to happen in the future. And then another thing that can happen with climate change is warming in particular can create physiological effects that are going to affect bees and plants. So bees have got an upper flight temperature limit. And this limit, I'm not talking about the ambient temperature, but I'm talking about the temperature in the bee's thorax. That's that center part where the wings are. Flying creates a lot of heat. If that thorax internally starts to approach 110 degrees Fahrenheit, then they risk overheating and possible injury and death. Basically, the proteins start unraveling, and that's a very bad thing. Also, nectar and pollen quantity and quality can be detrimentally impacted by higher temperatures. So the quantity of pollen has been shown in some plant species to drop as the ambient temperatures increase. And also the quality will do the same thing. It's not, that's not across every plant, but nonetheless, it's a warning sign. And maybe, almost most importantly, especially in the near term, is organisms, ourselves included, we don't respond to averages. So when you go read about climate change and they say, well, the average temperature, we want to keep the increase under 1.5 degrees in the next, so many years. Well, okay, great. 1.5 degrees C, that doesn't seem like much. But what about 1 or 2 week extreme events? Heat waves. We see people dying from heat waves. Well, the same thing can happen to local pollinator populations. So even though, the climate change itself is going real slow, it's, 0.5 degree per 2 decades or whatever. Here you have a 2-week heat wave. Well, it's capable of killing off all the pollinators if it's bad enough in a local area. So it's a very important thing. So at this point, we've covered bee basics and threats. And now I want to get, really to the heart of the matter. Why are we all here doing this? You listening and me talking. Well, this is about how can you make a difference, right? What can you do? First of all, I want to point out that beekeeping, although it's, a great hobby, lots of fun for people that do it, beekeeping is not bee conservation, not in any way, shape, or form. If you want to help pollinators, do things specific to native pollinators, and that will in fact also help honeybees if you're interested in them. So one of the things we've got to do is provide good habitat. and I stress the word good. So, good habitat is the foundation for pollinator conservation. That's what it's all about. And if you don't have that, then you have suboptimal conservation, let's put it that way. And what bees need is they need secure nest sites, they need plenty of forage opportunities, and that forage needs to be present as long as they need forage. So remember that adult solitary bee, only around maybe 2, 3, 4 weeks. Okay, that's how long that bee requires forage. The bumblebees, they were around from late winter until late, summer, going in maybe all the way to late fall. So that's a lot longer period of time. So that's a little trickier because you got to provide forage over that period of time. And then very importantly, they need to have a pesticide-free environment. Now, before going on, I'd like to mention this concept of habitat mosaics. And I want you to just kind of get a feel for what this means. So this is a bee. And if you look at this as a mosaic, you'll see 5 tiles. And each one of these is a picture of a different habitat area, each of which provides its own benefit to, say, a local pollinator. And the takeaway that I want you to get from this, and we're going to talk more about this right after this, is that you, in your yard, you do not have to provide every tile that makes up this mosaic. So as long as the tiles are there, could be your neighbors, could be a vacant lot, doesn't matter. As long as all the elements are there, we still have a complete mosaic. So these partial habitats or tiles that I talked about earlier, let's just see what that might look like in a neighborhood. So if you look at the upper right-hand corner, you're going to see a ground nesting bee. And there's a little arrow that shows where that ground nest is located at. And if you look at that dashed, or not dashed, but green dotted line, there are numbers along there and they correspond to these inset pictures. And I'm not going to go over them all, but just for instance, number 5 is a prairie pocket. That actually was one of the tiles on that mosaic I showed you. And there are other aspects along that route that fill in the needs of this particular bee. So, this bee's habitat needs are met in something like what, maybe half a dozen different yards. So partial habitats are fine. These are more partial habitats, and you might find them next to where you live. Office parks have, a lot of times fields next to them. Power line corridors, strips along roadways or parking lots. So, when you think about what you're providing and you think about, okay, what do I need all together? You can try to fit in what you can give along with what else is in the area there. And if you're lucky enough to have, a big yard and you can do all this stuff on your own, that's great too. So with these natural areas, what you want to do if you're in control of the area is retain natural or existing bee or pollinator friendly aspects. So bare ground in the picture down below, those ground nesting bees love that. Look at the trees up above, there's probably some beetle borer holes in there. So these are good things to keep around. Shrubs that have got hollow stems, those tunnel nesters want that. Ground nesting bees, they need a patch, but it doesn't have to be large. This picture here shows a landscape rock adjacent to a driveway edge. The distance there is maybe 10 inches. And if you look closely under the rock, you'll see a hole. You'll see a bunch of excavated soil. And actually you see more than one hole if you look close enough. This excavated soil is from a bee nest, some kind of a ground nesting bee. So, you know, you don't have to have a big area in order to serve the needs of our pollinators. Sure, most of you have seen these at your local nursery. These nest blocks, you can build your own, you can buy them, or hollow stems. If you use these, the thing you want to keep in mind is that they need to be cleaned out every year with a dilute bleach solution. And every 2 to 3 years, you need to just toss them and get new ones. Because what invariably is going to happen is you're going to have a buildup of pathogens and parasites that are attracted to bee nest. You know, we could have a whole talk on bee ecosystems, bee nest ecosystems. It's amazing how many different things live in bee nest. So you got to get rid of them every few years. Also, one thing to keep in mind is make sure that they're securely attached. You don't want them blowing around in the wind and disturbing things. And it's a good idea to keep them 3 or 4 feet off the ground so that they don't, sometimes moist air pools in some locations, so it just keeps them up. And as far as sun exposure, the best thing is to have kind of a southeast facing exposure on these so that they catch the morning sun to warm up, but they avoid the hottest part of the afternoon sun. If you look at your nest blocks, provided you put some out, you'll be able to tell what is using your nest. So if you look at the top there, that's chewed up pieces of plant material. And from what we've already learned, we know that that is probably some kind of a leaf cutter bee that's done that. Down below, we see dirt, basically, mud, and that tells us that we've got a mason bee without knowing anything else. Sometimes you'll get more than bees taking up residence. If you look at that piece of grass, that is actually being pulled inside by a solitary wasp. These are great little predators. They will eat a lot of pest insects, and they won't bother you. You know, they're not aggressive. So you can help more than one pollinator type with these kind of blocks. For those of you that like projects, you can try something like an artificial bumblebee nest, but you know, be warned that at the most, these are maybe a 20% uptake and probably less than that. You know, it's a fun little project. I've made them for 3 years in a row, tried different designs. So far, I've had 0 luck, but I continue to do it and try to learn about, you know, what the natural ones look like so that I can maybe make my designs better. Now I want to talk about forage patches, you know, critical component of that good habitat that we talked about. So plants bloom everywhere, but not all flowers help pollinators. And if you think about that for a second, not all flowers help pollinators. That does seem like a strange thing to say, because I told you earlier that bees will take nectar from just about anything as long as, you know, their tongue length matches. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So if you're going and looking to improve your yard for pollinators, one thing you want to do is retain existing patches and create new ones. And don't decrease forage in the process. That's why the retain existing is there. If you come up with a nice plan, what you don't want to do is rip out some goods, some things now that are providing forage and get to where you've got less before your new plants really come online. And then you want to remember, locally native plants are better. There have been numerous studies that show that native plants create a higher diversity of native bees. When it comes to plants, we have, a huge amount of choices to make. What color do we want? Look at color. Bees, they don't see red. They see, blues, yellows, purples. They see ultraviolet, which we don't see. They don't see red. In terms of diversity, it's good to have diversity, if for no other reason than to serve the various needs of bees that have different length tongues. But there's more reasons than that. Bloom period. Go back to what I said. If you want to support a local bumblebee colony, then you've got to have bloom from start to stop of their season. Native species, again, try to stick with natives. With climate changing the way it is, drought tolerance is very important. And then the overall landscape context, the overall landscape context, we go back to what that mosaic that I talked about earlier. How do you fit in? Do you provide everything, or do you work with other elements in your area? So before I go on, I just want to comment on something. I said bees don't see red, but if you think about it, you've probably all seen bees on red flowers. So what are they doing? Well, look at the picture on the far left. That is a cinquefoil in normal light. And presumably, since bees don't see red, that looks black to a bee. Now let's look at the same flower under UV light. Notice what happens? It looks totally different, and there's a bullseye that occurs. That bullseye is going to look to a bee like black surrounded by white. And flower bullseyes are very common. It attracts pollinators. It's there to show them where to go. Same with, you've probably heard of landing strips. Like some iris have these to draw pollinators to the center. So I just wanted to point out this fact that, does the bee see the flower different than we do? So maybe the best thing to do, if you want red flowers, go to your local nursery and walk around and see which types of flowers are being used by pollinators, right? So if you've got a local native plant nursery and there's something there that's drawing nothing, I wouldn't pick it for my yard. But just because it's red doesn't mean it can't be beneficial. So this is something I'm putting out here as an idea, suggestion. If you really would like to work on providing forage over a period of time to make sure that you don't have any gaps in your coverage, I put this chart together in Excel. It's my own yard. It's a partial list of what I have. And this allows me to look and just see if I've got good cover. The colors more or less approximate the bloom color on the plants. And you can see that there are no months that I don't have several, at least, different kinds of flowers in bloom. So to summarize what I've been saying so far, native is best, and you want to provide bloom from late winter to late fall. These pictures are plants that go from the left, that's Oregon grape and some kind of willow. Those are early bloomers. And then all the way through to on the right-hand side, looks like, some kind of an aster, probably, and then, or centaurea, I'm not sure, and maybe grindelli or something like that, gumweed down on the bottom. But you want to cover the spectrum. You go from one part of the year to the other. Now, earlier I said bees are the most important pollinators. The other ones are really accidental pollinators. But, many of us just love butterflies and like to have those in our yard. So I thought I'd just briefly bring this up, especially if you're interested in having larval host plants for butterflies so that you can do a better job of not only attracting them, but providing for their caterpillars. So if you go on to Xerces resources, there's a ton of things you can find on this. This book on the left is a Xerces Society publication, but there's a website on butterflies and moss in North America. And I'm gonna go and click this link, and if everything works out, I'll show you real time how to do this. And if not, the next slide will allow me to talk through it. And by the way, Washington has 194 species of butterflies and moss. So here we have an annoying advertisement, which will make go away. And then,
Hey, Dave, actually, it's the screen share is still on the PowerPoint. I think you might have to stop.
well, that's, oh, it's, oh, wait, it's still in the PowerPoint right now?
Yeah, you could stop sharing your screen and then start another share screen and then go to your.
Okay, cycle it. Okay, so I'm going to stop share, and then I'm going to go to share. Okay, do you have butterflies and moss in North America now?
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, so if we go to this website, look up here where it says species profiles, you'll see regional checklist. And I've already clicked on that, so I'm not going to click again. And I've got this region sorted out: the United States, Washington, Clark County. And here is a list of all the species of butterflies and moss that have been found in Clark County. Now, let's say that we are interested in, a Western tiger swallowtail. Everybody likes that. So if we click on this link, it's going to take us to that page with another annoying ad. And then we'll go down here and look at caterpillar host. So what do we have here? We've got cottonwood, aspen, willows, wild cherry, not necessarily going to work for everybody, and ash. So these hosts on this one are, mostly trees, basically, and some large shrubs, wild cherry. How about adult food? Just to provide that, thistles, we probably try to get rid of those. Zinnia, yerba santa, that's a California yerba santa is what it's usually called. That is something that normally, it's a really great pollinator plant. Bumblebees just love it. They go nuts when they are on that stuff. But anyway, I just want to show this is how this works. So if you're really interested in butterflies and you really want to get down to, I want to provide some host plants for my favorite butterflies, this is the way you do it. So now I'm going to stop sharing. We're going to go back. Okay, are we back?
Yep.
Okay. We'll skip that. So now, just to say a few words about garden plants or ornamental plants is probably what we usually refer to these as. They are okay in a formal landscape when they're chosen carefully. You know, many ornamentals are good plants for providing nectar. And maybe pollen too. I mean, maybe they're not natives and they're not what our natives have grown up with. That doesn't mean they're not usable. But, you know, as with making changes to your plant selection I talked about earlier, don't rip stuff out first. If you decide to go in and start making some changes, get rid of some ornamentals, put in some natives, always keep in mind, I don't want to decrease my present level of forage availability, if I can help it. Finally, we're going to get to something I mentioned earlier. I said, not all flowers are beneficial for bees. And this is what I'm talking about. These are what are called double flowered varieties. And these are cultivars or hybrids that have exploited naturally occurring mutations in the plants. And a lot of times what'll happen is, say the stamen of a plant will have a mutation. Well, the plant will have a mutation where one or more of the stamens will turn into a flower petal. And so the breeders think, oh, well, now this is great. I'm going to keep seeing if I can get more and more flower petals because I'll create this, you know, really full petaled plant. The problem with that is you're not only decreasing the number of stamens, and that's where the pollen is, remember, but you're also making it next to impossible for a pollinator to get down to where the nectar is or the stamens. They just can't get through this. It's like thick brush as far as they're concerned. So you want to avoid those double flowered plants. Lawns can be a nice resource for your pollinators. You know, if you really want to go all out, you can put in an eco lawn. Now, I'm not going to, you know, you can find online extension agency or something, you know, good resources for how to do that. Also, you can apply something called benign neglect. And benign neglect is just that, let it go. This picture is actually a part of my front yard. And as you can tell, I haven't mowed here. And it's just full of bumblebees, and I mean full of bumblebees. And these particular plants that you're seeing here, they go late in the summer when a lot of other things are not blooming. And so I just let it go. And just as a side note, when I took this picture, this was last year, right, if you see that green cylinder on the right-hand side of the screen, just to the left of that, about 1 foot to the left of that, is a bumblebee nest. And I didn't even know it was there until I was standing talking to my neighbor and a bumblebee landed on that fence there. And I thought, what the heck? And then it dropped down into the grass, and sure enough, there was a bumblebee nest. So it's very easy to live with bumblebees. You don't want to, you know, go and exterminate the nest because they really won't give you any problems. And they'll be gone at the end of the year anyway. So going back to those nasty old pesticides. So avoid them if at all possible, period. If you have to use them, minimize the use, read the guidance, but I want to warn you that even if you follow label instructions, it doesn't mean they're safe for pollinators. Even if it says be safe, because when they test these things, they test them on honeybees. Honeybees are big bees, as bees go. Not the biggest, but there's many, many, many smaller bees. And the same amount of pesticide that will leave a honeybee alive will kill a small bee. Okay? So best thing is just walk away from them. Displaced pesticides is something I want to talk about. What do I mean by this? What I mean is displaced from a nursery to your yard. Remember the bumblebee die-off? That was a systemic pesticide. And if you're not careful, there are a lot of nurseries out there, especially big box nurseries, that carry plants that have got systemic pesticides. And some of these big boxes have made commitments to cleaning that up. So, you know, it's not as bad as it was. But the thing to remember is that some of these neonicotinoids, which is one type of a systemic, they can stay up to years in a woody plant or months in a herbaceous plant. And if you take a treated plant, put it in your yard, you know, it's basically like putting out poison pots, because that's exactly what you're doing. So what I want you to do is when you go to your nurseries, ask them, are they treated with systemic pesticides? And if they say, I don't know, or some other lame excuse, say, well, I'm not going to be buying. And it's that simple. Good businesses listen to their customers. And that's how you make change occur. If you have a problem, use alternatives. There are beneficial, you know, predators and parasitoids out there. But one of the best things you can do is just provide great pollinator habitat, because, you know, great pollinator habitat does much more than help pollinators. There's all kinds of other beneficial invertebrates that will be drawn to good habitat, and they will help keep things in check. You want something that's more like a natural ecosystem. The closer it is to a natural ecosystem, the less often you're going to have some kind of a runaway. You don't have runaway pests in nature typically. And finally, get involved. You know, do something. I want to challenge you that when this talk is over with, go out there and make a difference. Don't just forget about what I've said here. First thing you can do, real simple, go to the bringbackthepollinators.org, read it, see if you can agree to do these 4 things, 4 principles, and sign the pledge that you're going to do it. Commit to it. You can get one of these pollinator habitat signs and put that in your yard. Bee City USA. If you live in a city, you can go try to find somebody on the city council or something like that and see if they're interested in getting into this Bee City USA program. It's a great thing. And what it does is it gets the city to commit to creating a more friendly environment for pollinators. Community science is something that is real easy to get involved in for most people, not everybody maybe. The Xerces Society has these projects that I'm showing here. Bumblebee Watch, that's something that is happening here. This photo is showing somebody capturing a photo to upload to Bumblebee Watch. Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, that is Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. You can sign up. I've volunteered and do bumblebee surveys for this group. I've done these 3 years now. There are some other Bumblebee Atlas type projects. There's also a Western Monarch milkweed mapper that you can do. And there's other things out there, but community science is something where you can get involved and help make a difference. If you want to learn more about this stuff, these are some books by the Xerces Society. They're very good. Attracting Native Pollinators is an excellent book. 100 Plants to Feed the Bees, another great book. Xerces, has professional scientists that make it their business to know this stuff, the nuts and bolts. So they put these books together and they're really great and they're hard to get anything better. There are a lot of free downloads that you can get. There's just an enormous selection. This doesn't even begin to show you how many things are out there. YouTube is a very great resource. There's a Xerces Society YouTube channel, and there are just numerous educational webinars that you can watch on pollinators and other invertebrates and pesticides and you name it and they have it. They're very well done. If you're a social media type, you can connect in any of these ways. And finally, we're always looking for people to join Xerces and help provide support. So at this time, I want to thank you for listening to me, and I am open to questions. Sorry, my voice was given out some, but and if you'll just excuse me, I have got to go get another glass of water before I go into questions.
I'll just let people know how to ask questions again while you do that.
Okay.
Dave. Yeah, since I said this at the beginning of the talk, but if you weren't there at the time, the way you can ask questions is through the chat. And at the bottom of the Zoom window, there is an icon labeled chat. And feel free to just go ahead and type your question in there. And Dave will respond. And at the moment, we don't have any questions. So, oh, here comes one right now. Let's see. Okay, I'll just pull that up for you, Dave. There's one in the chat. I can read it out loud if you like, or if you wanted to open that up. Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I can do that. I wasn't thinking. So yeah, I'll go ahead and read it here. So this is from MD. Another conundrum is having toxic weeds such as tansy and thistle, which the county says you must eliminate, yet the pollinators do love them. These noxious weeds are really hard to eliminate, and if you have large property, pulling by hand is pretty impossible. Comments? Well, yes. Well, yeah, tansy, I consider that to be more of a toxic or noxious, I should say, than thistle, especially native thistles. There are a lot of good native thistles. They're starting to become a little bit more popular. But, if you have to take them out, I mean, there are times when you need to use herbicides as spot treatments. I think what I would advise is go on to the Xerces website, and maybe there's like an info, I think, on there, and you could ask that question to somebody that specializes. I'm more of a pollinator oriented, and I'm not the best person here, but to answer this question. But sometimes you use an herbicide. Herbicides are not as bad as something like a fungicide. It ends up, surprisingly, fungicides are almost in some cases worse than insecticides in what they do to bees. It's kind of crazy.
But that's my answer. I'm sorry I couldn't have given you a little bit better guidance on that. So next one is from Randy. I've read that it's best to plant a lot of the same plants all in a group instead of spread out. You're absolutely right. And I should have said that. Well, you know, there's only so much I can put in this presentation, but yes, that you're absolutely right. You want to have a fairly large group of the same species of plant. It creates a bigger target when they're flying over in a search. And also I talked about that flower constancy. So there's something called handling times, and it varies with the flower morphology. So if you look at the structure of flowers, it varies quite a bit. So flowers in the pea family are particularly difficult for some bees to open up, and they won't go to them. Heavier bees like a bumblebees can get into them. But when you have groupings like that, it makes the bee itself more efficient if it gets to work the same puzzle over and over again, is a way to think about it. So yeah, that's a good point, and thanks for bringing that up. So this is from Andrea. How well is Xerces familiar with the new mite that has been traveling? Do you have the name of the mite? It's not a varroa? Yeah, I know you can't, I don't know why I asked that question out loud. You can't answer it, but you could put it in the chat or something like that. If you put it in the chat and it comes up, if you do know the name, I can do some investigation to get it back to Marlene. But let me just say this, there are tons of different kinds of mites. I talked about the ecosystem inside of a bee nest. There are tons of mites, and a lot of times they're specific to a given species of bee. And so they're, you know, typically the mites, some of them are feeding on the bees, but a lot of times they're just living in the nest and eating wax and detritus and things like that. And they're really, it's a kind of a commensal symbiotic relationship.
And Andrea did say she wasn't sure of the name.
Okay.
But her husband learned about it.
Oh, this is from Marlene. How do you feel about insecticidal soaps? I think that those are supposed to be a fairly okay solution. I mean, you know, spot treated. What you're doing there is you're just smothering the insect because, you know, they've got their trachea, their breathing holes all along the abdomen. And so, you know, that's not leaving poisons behind. So if you've got a pest that you've got to do that, I think that's probably an okay route. Much better than spraying it with a poison. Here's something from Kay. Where is the best placement for bumblebees, shade or sun? I think I read sun. Yeah, so now when you say bumblebees, are you talking about nest or plants? And instead of having you answer that, I'm just going to go ahead and answer for both of them. So if you're looking at the placement of plants for bumblebees, in general, they do, pollinators in general like plants that are out in the sun. I mentioned that they can overheat, but they also have a problem when it's cold out. That's why you see bumblebees earlier in the morning. They're a large, furry pollinator. Honeybees don't come out as early as bumblebees because they just can't. They need to warm up to a certain degree before they can fly. So for plants, the sun is preferable. If you're talking about placement of, say, an artificial nest that you're trying to create, that would be a southern slope like the other bees that I talked about, and southern sunny slope would be good. It could be a shadow edge if you've got a woodsy kind of area. Oh, okay, you are talking, sorry, I should have read the rest of the thing. You are talking about a nest, so the upside down flower pot with mouse. Yes, I tried a flower pot one time. I didn't have any luck. But yeah, so I think that in the sun would be fine.
Good evening. The library.
Pardon?
Sorry, that's an overhead announcement on the library.
Oh, okay. So the next is from Sharon. You might mow or weed whack the flowers on thistle, and when they shrivel and aren't drawing bees, spray the foliage. Oh, okay, this is a comment for the other person. Yes, evening applications when the bees are absolutely spot on that. If you're putting something down, do it when the bees are not active. And that's a great idea on getting rid of the flowers. I didn't think about that myself. Next one from Kay. Is it good to provide water for bees, and how should that be done? I've seen drowned bees in water containers. So this is very interesting. I have seen cases where water is talked about and not discussed. I have seen, for instance, I mean, the short answer is they get most of their water needs out of the nectar. That's mostly water. But I have seen instances where people have taken coiled up soaker hoses, and that little bit of perspiration that comes out can be useful for bees and other pollinators for that matter. I myself have dealt with drowned bees in water containers, especially if they're this kind of really bright blue artificial color. There's a certain color of blue that attracts bees. They actually use them for traps, vane traps. And if you've got water in something like that, we had in a dog bowl outside, it just draws them. So I wouldn't have large water containers put out if you're going to do water for a bee or other pollinators, and it's not going to be harmful, but use something like a soaker hose. This is from Andrea.
Follow-up comments.
Okay, this is on the mic. She doesn't have the name.
Mhm.
Oh, in the beekeeping course, huh? Okay. Yeah, I'm not, my focus has always been on natives, so I'm not real familiar with all the things going on with beekeeping mites right now. But I'm not surprised. I mean, there's tons of mites out there. From Amy, which plants specifically attract the most pollinators to your garden? So I can't answer this. Number one, you got to specify what kind of pollinators. And yeah, this is very complex. I'm not trying to dodge this thing, but there are so many different variables at work here. You'd have to really look at, where are you? Where are you located? What does this look like around there? But like you can't say single down and say this one or two plants, these one or two plants, if you put these in, they're going to attract the most things. We've got to go back and remember about diversity of plants. So, if you go to something like 100 plants for the bees, and you look across there and you pick a diverse selection in terms of flower depth, we're talking about the depth of the corolla, have, short, broad flowers like asters. What you want to do is make sure that you support, that you provide something that matches the physiological or the morphological structure of these pollinators. Right, so butterflies have got really long, but they can get down into fairly deep flowers. Same with moths. It's some of the smaller bees that have probably the biggest trouble, and some flies. They're not, again, important pollinators per se, the flies, but I just bring this up. So you really have to have, it's not which so much as what structure you're providing. So think of it more in terms of the plant structures that the floral structures versus the particular species. And I'll just say one more time that the pea family plants are very good pollen sources. Okay, from Lisa, my husband made a pollinator house. So get rid of the pieces of wood and rolled grass every few years. Just yes, you want to get rid of them every few years. And you want to clean them every year, because after one nest season, there's going to be parasites in there. And so you need to do that bleach solution every year. From Kay, it just says nest, and I'm not sure. Oh, she's answering the previous question. Okay. And I figured that out. From Rachel, bees in my yard love Nepeta. Yes, that's very popular with bees. And lavender, yeah. Also I have the native primrose. And they love it, as do finches. It is pretty much a weed, so I'd only put it in a wild area. Yeah, I don't like using the word weed because weed's just another wildflower. But anyway, yeah, that's fine. I mean, we have to decide for ourselves what we want our yards to look like. And you can put in plants that have not a darn thing to do with pollinators. That's fine. I mean, we have every right to have plants for us too. So yeah, that's good. Yeah, and those plants you're talking about, yeah, those are all good. Again, they're not natives, the Nepeta and the lavender, but they can still provide a benefit. When is the best time to clean out native bee houses? So you want to make sure, okay. Now this is going to be, what you want to do is you want to do it after they emerge in the spring. So you have to kind of keep an eye out, right? Because you've got these bees that are going to spend 11 months out of the year in the nest, basically. And then they're going to pop out of there. And some of them are going to pop out, the 1st of March, and some of them aren't going to pop out until September. And so, it requires a little bit of diligence that way. And it makes things complicated, to be quite honest with you, because you always have to worry about whether you're going to kill one of the babies that's in, or not babies anymore, but one of the pupas that are in there. I'm sorry I didn't really give a better question or answer than that, but it's something to be thinking about if you can do it after they've emerged. And maybe you can do it cylinder by cylinder, basically. Just stick a Q-tip with some bleach solution down in there, or whatever is the appropriate size. And once you've had an emergence, then that's clean and it can be reused. Okay, Sherry Shang, Oregon State University Garden Ecology. Yeah, attractive native bees, sure. Yeah, there's a number of places. I've got one of their papers pulled up right now on my Safari, and in fact, they run the master melitologist program that I'm in. Okay, very good point. I think we're at the end of the questions.
Yeah. Let's see, we do have another 10 minutes if there are any questions. If not, that's okay too.
We got a raised hand. So Sherry,
yeah.
Sherry Shang raised hand. Do you want to put, Sherry, do you want to just put something into the chat? Oh, here we go. Oh, you're the one that put in, maybe I saw a delayed raised hand. Sorry about that. Brandy, you're welcome. I really want to thank everybody for taking the time to listen to this presentation, and sorry, my voice gave out in a few places.
Yeah, and just want to remind people too that this is recorded, and so I'll send out the link to the recording next week. Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, Marlene, Dave, do you have any final comments?
Well, yes, I would like to thank Dave. Thank you so much, Dave. That was great. And also thanks to you, Elliot, and the Camas Library for hosting us once again. We've had this partnership now since pretty much the beginning of COVID, and we couldn't have done it without you. So we really appreciate you and all the work you do behind the scenes that everybody can't see in setting these things up. And again, thanks, Dave, and please thank the Xerces Society for us. It was great.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting us to talk. Really appreciate that, and let's everybody go out and do our thing.
It sounds good. Thanks so much, Dave. Thanks so
Okay.
much, Marlene. All right, hope everyone has a good evening. Okay. All right.
Save the bees.